The benches along Alder Park gleam with frost this time of year, varnished by nights that never quite forgive the sun for leaving. Before dawn, the pathways glow bluish, a hush of street lamp halos catching their breath on every twig. Those hours belong to the city's loneliest employers, milk trucks, insomniac pigeons, the wind practicing its scales, and to a single metal thermos, standing proudly on the middle slat of the fourth bench from the west gate. I found it first when I was 11 and already acquainted with being invisible. My mother worked double shifts, sewing buttons onto suits no one in our neighborhood could afford. My father had whittled himself into a roomer years earlier. After school, I would walk to Alder Park to avoid the echo of our apartment, sit with my backpack wedged against my chest, and count the stray dogs trotting by. It was the easiest arithmetic: appearance, disappearance, silence. That January afternoon, the air bit through my coat's thin cotton while I waited for darkness to thicken enough to justify going home. I almost didn't see the thermos, its brushed steel body steaming like a horse in the cold. Beside it lay a folded square of lined paper, weighted by a pebble, smoothed by river water. Sip slowly, the night is long. No signature, no date. The handwriting was narrow, angled forward as if chased by its own urgency. The scent of black tea curled upward. Strong Assam, slightly smoky, laced with something citrus. I should have been cautious, but loneliness has a talent for overriding every survival lesson. I drank. The heat slipped down my throat, blooming in my chest in a way I would later recognize as mercy. The cup's warmth made my eyes sting, and I blinked hard until the world sharpened again. I half expected someone to step from the shadows, demand the thermos back, or lecture me on accepting gifts from strangers. No one came. There was only the hush of crows shifting on bare branches and the distant thrum of a bus climbing the hill. The next day, the thermos returned, fresh steam, a fresh note. Some evenings need proof that tomorrow is possible. The ritual rooted itself quietly. Each weekday when the park lamps flickered awake, I found a new message and enough tea for 3 careful sips. Sometimes the notes sounded like instructions from an older sibling I never had. Wear thicker socks, numb feet lie to the brain. Other times they were fragments of half-remembered poems. Loneliness is a hallway with a locked door at each end. Carry the keys you're handed. I never saw who left them. I began to imagine a librarian's heart behind that pen, or a retired cartographer mapping kindness instead of coastlines. I grew superstitious. If I skipped a day, would the thermos vanish forever? Without telling anyone, I started walking different routes to the park, doubling back, scanning corners for a movement too deliberate to belong to wind. But Alder Park kept its secret like a priest, silent, watchful, bound by an older oath. Weeks stretched into seasons. On my 12th birthday, I found the note folded into the shape of a swan. You are more real than the stories you tell yourself. Its wings trembled in a breeze that smelled faintly of thawing earth. I carried that swan in my pocket until the creases disintegrated, until only the sentiment remained, pressing softly against my ribs. By the spring, I started talking aloud to the empty air around the bench, as though the author hovered just beyond vision. I told them about the algebra test I failed, about the time I swung at a boy for calling my mother a ghost laborer, about how scared I was that my future might already be rusting. I never received answers, only the steadfast presence of tea and ink. Then came the afternoon of the red ink letter from school, the one that said I would repeat 7th grade if I didn't demonstrate measurable improvement. I trudged to Alder Park carrying more shame than body. On the bench waited the familiar thermos, yet the note beneath it wasn't folded. It was sprawled flat, words larger than usual. Every bridge looks impossible from a single plank away. That night the tea tasted different, brighter, almost floral, as though someone had measured hope in teaspoons. I stayed until the lamps blinked off at midnight, afraid the darkness might swallow the bench if I left it unattended. When I finally stood, I whispered thank you, and my breath drifted into the cold, unanswered, but somehow less alone. In summer the offerings stopped. The bench sat bare, sunlight bleaching the slats where condensation rings once lingered. I waited for weeks, inventing explanations that hurt less than abandonment. Perhaps the thermos bearer had traveled, or fallen ill, or decided their mission accomplished. Perhaps they trusted I could brew my own courage now. Yet each dusk without steam felt like a page torn from an unfinished chapter. Years ballooned. High school hardened my edges. College softened them again. The park became a shortcut between dorm and bookstore, nothing more. I told myself the thermos had been a kind hallucination conjured by adolescence until fortune, or fate, lured me back one October twilight while visiting my mother in the old neighborhood. There, on the 4th bench from the west gate, stood the thermos. But the note this time was addressed not to me, for the boy who might be drowning silently, drink, breathe, listen for the shore. A chill moved through my adult muscles, distinct from the evening cool. I scanned the path until I spotted him. A thin kid, hunched beneath a backpack too large, approaching with the careful suspicion I once wore. He paused, saw the thermos, and in his hesitation, I recognized an earlier version of myself teetering on the precipice of trust. I stepped back into the trees, watched him read, watched him drink, watched a small warmth spark in his posture. That's when I knew. The notes were never solely for me. They were for any child who might sit on that bench aching for evidence that compassion exists, even nameless, even unseen. And maybe the teacher who left them had saved more lives than I could count, including a few not yet born. I walked away before the boy could notice the silhouette among the pines, carrying the taste of black tea like a vow behind my teeth. How many acts of quiet rescue ripple forward unnoticed, until the day we realize we have been living inside someone else's gentle intention all along. Before the thermos, before the bench became an altar for unspoken salvations, there was only a classroom that smelled of chalk dust and aging linoleum. Room 3 to 14 sat at the end of a corridor whose fluorescent lights flickered like nervous eyelids. Most teachers complained, but Ms. Rao never asked for maintenance. She liked half-light. It honored the margins where shy questions live. She'd taught 6th grade literature for 27 Septembers, keeping notebooks on every student the way botanists catalogue rare moss. Meticulous, reverent, alert to subtle greening. The first page always listed the child's name, then 3 blank columns: secret strength, quiet fear, book that might save them. Each June, when students emptied their desks and the hallway filled with locker slams and shrieks of release, she filed those notebooks in a wooden cabinet no one else had the key to. Years later, she could open the drawer and recite where a boy first wept over a stanza, or where a girl discovered the selfish joy of metaphor. She carried those memories as one might carry warm stones in winter pockets, proof against the ache of cold. No one asked Miss Rao about her evenings. Colleagues assumed she graded essays, watched quiz shows, maybe knitted scarves that never left her apartment. They did not know that every dusk, after erasing chalk-white constellations of sentence diagrams, she packed 3 items into a canvas satchel: a battered thermos that smelled faintly of bergamot, no matter how often it was rinsed, a fountain pen whose nib had been ground to suit her slanted hand, and a tin of loose-leaf Assam wrapped in brown paper. Then she walked the 9 blocks to Alder Park, moving through the city as though she were tracing invisible staves of music only she could hear. Loneliness is a climate, not a condition. Ms. Rao had acclimated years ago, first when her husband left a postcard on the kitchen table that read, "Gone to find where my voice went," and later when the child they had almost named Arjun never took a first breath. Afterward, she discovered that grief can petrify into a quiet sturdiness. People stopped apologizing, mistaking her composure for recovery. Inside, whole decades rang hollow like unstruck bells. She might have remained inside that museum of contained sorrow had it not been for the afternoon she spotted a boy on the 4th bench from the west gate, thin elbows poking through a synthetic jacket, gaze fixed on nothing but the arithmetic of survival. He reminded her of a seed trapped beneath concrete, alive, yes, but deprived of the slender gap it needed to reach the sky. Most passers-by registered him as vector data, coordinates of poverty plotted against urban neglect. Miss Rao, however, saw narrative, an incipient waiting for its first sentence. The next morning she filled her old thermos, hotter than advisable, and brewed tea dark enough to reflect constellations. She added a slice of orange peel for brightness, a punctuation of sun, she whispered, then set out while the city's arteries still yawned open. Steam coiled into the brittle air as she placed the thermos on the bench. She hesitated, pen hovering above the first scrap of notebook paper. Sip slowly, the night is long. 7 words, each chosen the way a jeweler chooses facets, made to scatter whatever light remained. She did not wait to see the boy read it. She could not risk witnessing disappointment if he ignored the gift. Instead, she retreated to the shadowed promenade, heart thudding in her ears like an unexpected visitor. From behind an iron lamppost she watched him approach, pause, and merciful sky, drink. That night she lay awake, mapping syllables against breaths, wondering what had compelled her. Compassion, yes, but also something more selfish, the chance to reroute her own abandoned tenderness toward a vessel still buoyant enough to receive it. Teaching had always been a transaction of futures, a promise that someone else's tomorrow might justify today's exhaustion. Yet here, outside institutional walls, gratitude would remain anonymous, uncontaminated by grades or applause. It felt pure. The ritual matured. Every dawn she drafted new sentences, some instructive, some prophetic, some stitched from classrooms of half-remembered verse. She varied the tea, strong Ceylon for courage, Nilgiri with clove when storms threatened. On frigid mornings she pre-warmed the thermos with boiling water as though arming hope itself against entropy. She noticed the boy change, the slump of his shoulders lifted by degrees. His eyes began to scan horizon lines instead of sidewalks. Sometimes he even carried a battered library book, holding it the way nestlings hold an inherited sky. Years will pass before she learns his name. By then the boy will be a man, and Mizrao will be a memory folded into his bloodstream. But for now she writes as though each line could splint a fracture in the earth. Some evenings need proof that tomorrow is possible. Wear thicker socks, numb feet lie to the brain. Loneliness is a hallway with a locked door at each end. Carry the keys you're handed. The city never thanks her, but it accommodates. Buses pause their diesel shouts as she crosses. Stray dogs sit in solemn witness while she arranges thermos, note, pebble. In return she speaks softly to them, blessing even their fleas with the dignity of attention. One April morning, when jacaranda petals carpet the path like spent confetti, she writes a line that trembles in her pen before it meets the page. You are more real than the stories you tell yourself. She wonders who the sentence is truly for. The boy, the version of herself that never cradled Arjun, or the husband's voice, wandering still. Perhaps sentences choose their own recipients, traveling by scent the way monarchs follow unseen currents. That afternoon, Ms. Rao remains in the park longer than usual, perched on a distant bench counting the beats of her unnamed heartache. When the boy appears and unfolds the note, she sees his breath hitch, sees him slip the paper carefully into his pocket rather than discard it as he sometimes does. The gesture releases something in her chest, a little flock of birds, long caged. She goes home afterward and brews an extra cup, setting it opposite her at the kitchen table. The steam rises between two chairs, mingling like voices at last reunited. She drinks for herself, for the boy, for the life that might still be saved, though she cannot yet name whose. Outside, dusk eases its weight onto rooftops, and Ms. Rao thinks, hope without acknowledgement is the purest hope of all. She tightens the cap on the thermos, readying tomorrow's mercy.
Follow the line.
If kindness is a language spoken mostly in secret, how many dialects of rescue are we capable of learning before someone finally hears us speak? The day the ritual broke open, I was 26 and already practicing adulthood the way children practice handwriting, laboriously, full of false starts, every line overturning the one before it. I taught introductory history at a community college, 3 suburbs south of Alder Park, a post that paid more in astonished gratitude than in currency. My lectures were footnoted with the hush I remembered from Ms. Rao's classroom, though I did not yet realize I was quoting her silence. Winter had come petulantly early, icing the riverbanks and shuttering shopfronts by 5. On a Wednesday glazed with freezing rain, I finished office hours late, shouldered my coat, and felt a tug, faint as static, pulling me north. I told myself I wanted a shortcut to the metro, but my shoes found the park like they had never unlearned the route. Memory is a compass that ignores permission. Lamplight spilled across the paths, tawny and granular as old film. The benches were empty, beads of water trembling on every iron armrest. Yet the 4th slat from the west gate held its shape in the gloom, absorbing praise from the single halo above it. I almost walked past. Grown men do not pause at childhood altars, but something stopped me. Not a thermos, not a note, but the absence of both, vocal as a siren. The bench looked wrong without its offering, like a sentence missing its verb. A skein of wind dragged cold across my face. When I glanced back, a thermos stood there, impossible, silent, steaming. I had neither heard nor seen anyone approach. The metal glowed faintly, as though lit from within. Beside it the customary pebble, underneath a paper square, edges fluttering. My breath stuttered. Noon lecture on the Treaty of Utrecht evaporated. Rent payments, dinner plans, unread emails, all sluiced away. I stepped closer. The handwriting slanted forward, familiar yet fraying at its loops, each letter wearing a thin bruise of hesitation. If you know what it means to arrive too late, take the thermos to its beginning. Below the sentence, an address, 45 Rowan Street, Unit 7C, a building on the far edge of my old neighborhood, across from a shuttered textile mill. I lifted the thermos, lighter than memory suggested, but still warm. The lid bore a hairline crack, a detail I had never noticed in childhood. A crack that spoke of fools, absorbed without complaint. I scanned the park. Leaves spiraled down the empty avenues, but no figure slipped away, no coat hem caught the corner of my sight. Even the dogs had surrendered the night. I stood alone with metal humming against my palm, heart ricocheting. Something inside me, some frightened archivist, wanted to catalogue possibilities. A hoax, an echo, a coincidence. But the deeper mechanism, the one tuned by years of silent compassion, overruled. I pocketed the note, cradled the thermos, and walked. Rowan Street gleamed with rain-slick dimness. Street numbers leaned at odd angles, digits corroded by decades of weather. Unit 7C occupied the top floor of a walk-up that smelled of old varnish and forgotten dinners. The hallway was wound-warm despite the season, radiators clanking like distant artillery. At the door a shape of paper waited, taped at eye level, a square of lined notebook torn with clean urgency. Inside lies the origin of your warmth. Knock gently, grief is sleeping. My knuckles hovered, reluctant to disturb any slumber that grief might finally have found. I tapped once. Silence answered. I tried the handle, unlocked. The apartment interior belonged to twilight, curtains drawn, lights off, air scented faintly with bergamot and dust. Moonlight from a back window painted pale ladders across parquet flooring. Furniture sparse, one armchair, a bookcase half emptied, boxes labeled in tidy script, class drafts, student letters, thermosol. On a small kitchen table lay an envelope addressed not to me, but to whoever still carries the heat. Next to it, a stack of composition notebooks bound with twine, the top labeled "Book That Might Save Them." My lungs felt too large for my ribs. I turned, intending to retreat, when a soft wheeze lifted from the doorway behind me. Ms. Rao, older by years but unmistakable, stood propped on a cane, coat soaked, hair silvering at her temples like frost. Surprise crossed her face only briefly, quickly replaced by something between apology and relief. "You came," she whispered, voice husked by unused sentences. I worried I'd miscalculated the angle of need. Words packed my mouth, none coherent. I handed her the thermos. She accepted it, fingers trembling, then pressed it to her sternum as though suturing a wound. "I believed the chain would continue without me," she said. "But the bench sat empty 4 nights in a row. I feared perhaps kindness, once released, still needs tending." She gestured to the notebooks. "These are the records. Every child, every note, every tea blend measured against season and sorrow. I cannot keep them anymore." Her eyes searched mine, not for permission, but for confirmation of a truth we now shared. Hope can be inherited. Rain clattered against the window. Somewhere a radiator sighed.
"I tried to prepare someone,"
she continued, "but preparation and readiness are strangers, so I left a final instruction. I thought the bench would know who to summon." I looked at the thermos, the cracked lid glinting. The object had traveled years and hearts to land in my hands again. I imagined the unnoticed boys and girls who had sipped its warmth since my departures, each believing themselves the only recipient of an unnamed mercy. Intergenerational rescue, quietly compounding interest. "I'll tend the chain," I said, surprising myself with the solidity of the vow. "Not alone. I'll teach others. No child should wait upon frost for proof." Mesrawa's posture slackened, as if a long-borne pack had slipped from her shoulders. She set the thermos on the counter, unscrewed the lid, poured 2 cups, the tea ribboned amber beneath the weak bulb, scent filling the small room with a memory of morning, even at midnight. We drank in silence while time rearranged its furniture. When the cups emptied, she pressed the apartment key into my palm. "Save who you can," she murmured, "especially the selves you haven't met yet." I left as dawn was unseaming the clouds, notebooks cradled to my chest, pockets steeped in bergamot. The city looked newly drafted, streets thin as pencil lines awaiting ink. Every doorway held the potential for a thermos. Back at Alder Park, the bench awaited, lacquered by first light. I placed a fresh note beneath a river-rounded pebble, words trembling out of me like seedlings breaking soil. "If this cup finds you lonely, remember someone mapped this warmth long before your grief had a name." Steam threaded upward, signaling to futures I would never compute. Somewhere a child would follow that signal, somewhere further another would carry it on. The chain, imperfect but unbroken, clicked into its next link. When compassion outlives its originator and chooses you as custodian, do you measure the weight, or does it begin measuring the shape of who you must become? The first cup I left on the bench was meant to be a rehearsal, a way to confirm that kindness could be transferred like heat between vessels. Yet the moment I stepped back into the trees, a vortex of doubt unfurled inside my coat. My pulse scribbled warnings. What if the child who finds this bleeds from allergies you never asked about? What if strangers see only poison? What if hope, relayed once too many times, dilutes into danger? I spent the night at my desk, notebooks open like unwilling witnesses, tallying risk on yellow legal pads. Calculations turned obsessive, water-to-leaf ratios, ambient temperature, the half-life of trust. Dawn exposed the arithmetic as a shivering lattice of fear. Steam, after all, does not consult equations before rising. Classes resumed. My lectures morphed into palimpsests. Beneath every date of an armistice, I heard Miss Rauer's aphorisms humming, syllables clinking like teacups in my throat. Students noticed the fracture. One asked why my voice sounded like it was searching for a lost river. I assigned extra reading and dismissed them early, retreating to the staff bathroom to steady my hands under fluorescent confessionals. Even when I returned to the park each dusk, compassion felt heavier, a satchel packed with unnamed stones. Some evenings I stood over the thermos, unable to choose a sentence, paralyzed by the infinite tributaries a single line might create. More than once I contemplated leaving nothing, no tea, no note, imagining silence as a harmless entropy. But the memory of a younger self, frost burning his fingertips, hovered at the edge of every hesitation. In that stare I recognized an accusation. If rescue is optional, was my survival merely a whim? One Thursday, the city's electrical grid hiccuped, plunging Alder Park into brief blackout. I waited under blackout sky, clutching the thermos as though its warmth could guide satellites home. When the lamps finally flickered back to life, I saw a boy, smaller even than I'd been, huddled where the bench should have glowed. No bench, no slats. In the penumbra of failing bulbs, park workers had hauled the old seating away for sanding and paint. My altar was gone, replaced by sawdust and an orange traffic cone that read, "Pardon our progress." The boy's eyes met mine, wide and storm green, and I felt a cord snap. My carefully charted chain reduced to coordinates without an anchor. I pressed the thermos into his mittened hands without a word. He flinched, then clutched it the way shipwrecked men cling to barrels, possession before comprehension. I wanted to kneel, explain lineage, give him the galaxy of context he deserved. Instead I backed away, mouth caving around unsaid sentences. The lamp steadied, sodium light etched a question on his face. I feared I could not answer. I turned and walked until radio static filled my skull, until distance masqueraded as safety. That night I dreamed of thermoses marching in rows, lids rattling like war drums. Each bore a hairline crack that widened as they passed, spilling black tea across tile floors that stretched towards some edge I dared not approach. When I awoke, my apartment smelled of bergamot though no kettle had boiled. I began leaving tea in unpredictable places, under a playground slide, on the library's marble steps, in the crook of a statue's bronze elbow. Notes morphed into riddles, fragments of extinct alphabets. The randomness felt strategic. If I scattered hope like seeds, perhaps it would root where most needed. Yet I sensed Miss Rauer's disapproval in my pulse. A map without legend is indistinguishable from chaos. Weeks blurred, grading piled up like sediment. I marked essays while subconsciously sketching thermoses in the margins. In one paper, a student wrote, "History is the study of handovers, power, land, debt." I added in red ink before realizing, "and mercy." The notebooks in my closet, her cabinet transplanted, began to accuse me. Blank columns waited for quiet fear, and book that might save them, but my own columns stayed empty. I was tracking cups, not children, performing charity without intimacy. On the coldest evening of February, a storm glassed the streets in ice. I found myself back at Rowan Street, Unit 7C, key trembling like a tooth between gloved fingers. The apartment smelled stale, neglected. Ms. Rao had moved to hospice 2 weeks earlier, the landlord said, leaving no forwarding address, only rent prepaid for 6 months and a handwritten directive. Let him decide whether to keep or dismantle the archive. Inside, the cupboards brimmed with unlabeled tins. I opened one. Lavender buds mingled with lapsang soot, a floral smoke that stung my eyes. Another held coriander and dried orange peel. Rows upon rows, flavors I had never dared blend. Recipes, unvoiced choruses of comfort. I understood then, I was heir not just to ritual, but to experimentation, to the trembling courage of invention. At the kitchen table lay a single fresh note in her forward-leaning script, ink newly dried. Hope is a living language. When you fear mispronouncing it, that is when someone most needs to hear you speak. The letters wavered. Perhaps her hand had failed mid-stroke, yet the sentence landed with tidal clarity. I packed the tins into a crate, added blank notebooks and carried them out beneath a sky crusted with anxious stars. The city the next morning claimed record lows, but Alder Park glinted like sheeted silver. The bench, newly sanded, varnish uncured, waited poised as a patient heart. I set a thermos upon it, steam braiding with the air. The tea inside tasted unlike anything I'd brewed. Lavender smoke meeting citrus dusk, winter colliding with remembered spring. My note read only, "This cup is an experiment, and so are you. Sip, revise, continue." I stepped back, pulse calm for the first time in months. Snow powdered my shoulders, distant footsteps whispered through the birches. I realized the chain did not tighten around me. It widened, expanding to make space for mistakes, for improvisations, for failures transmuted into better attempts. Compassion, like language, welcomes dialects. Across the path, the storm-green-eyed boy pushed through drifts, drawn by scent or fate. He saw me. Recognition flickered but held no accusation. I nodded toward the thermos, granting permission. He unscrewed the lid, inhaled, and smiled. Small, incredulous, hopeful. Heat bled through the winter hush, knitting present to future. I understood that every crack in every lid was a doorway, not a flaw, and through those hairline thresholds warmth escaped precisely because someone else needed to feel it. When mercy evolves beyond the script you inherited, can you trust your own unsteady voice enough to keep speaking, knowing each mispronunciation may be the seed of a new dialect of rescue? When Miss Rao's obituary appeared, 2 inches of newsprint spoken in the curt tense of record-keeping, it arrived on a rainy Tuesday, the kind that makes newspapers bleed ink into fingertips. Beloved educator, survived by no immediate family. The line felt unfinished, like a sentence ending with an ellipsis. The typesetter refused to print. In the silence that followed, I understood the task that remained, to stitch her ellipsis into living speech. I took personal leave from the college, though I confessed no grief to human resources. Instead, I packed the archive tins of spiced leaf, notebooks of trembling observation, the cracked lid thermos, and rode the Greyhound west, following a thin map of rumor. Somewhere beyond the interstate, a rural library had offered to host a community program for stories that heal. A place, they said, where children waited after school because bus routes no longer reached their farmlands, where afternoons smelled of tractor exhaust and abandoned orchards. I imagined benches there too, rough-cut planks perhaps, but no one yet to anoint them with steam. The bus stuttered through miles of winter field, cornstalk stubble, bristling like stubble on an old man's jaw, silos leaning away from the sky's disinterest, windmills carving futile algebra into the low-grey clouds. I watched frostweb across the glass, and pictured each filament as lineage, a diagram of rescues branching in silence. Somewhere on that lattice sat my own point of origin, a boy counting stray dogs, unaware that kindness was etching his coordinates. At dusk the bus sighed onto a gravel shoulder, outside a town whose welcome sign had lost 3 letters to bullet holes. The library occupied a converted grain depot, red brick, windows arched like cathedral doorways. Inside, warmth pooled around radiators, fashioned from locomotive parts. A volunteer youth coordinator named Rena met me between shelves of almanacs. She looked scarcely older than my first-year students, yet carried herself with the unhurried certainty of someone who has failed spectacularly and survived. I grew up here, she said, gesturing to the dust-softened space. Most days felt like the world forgot our zip code, but stories keep sneaking in through cracks. Her smile was disarming, not because it was unguarded, but because it conceded nothing to pity. You said in your message you wanted to teach tea as language. That sounded necessary. We cleared a corner beside the biography stacks, a folding table, 2 mismatched armchairs, a chipped kettle, scavenged from the staff lounge. I unpacked tins like relics, Nilgiri with chocolate nibs, Ceylon and tamarind, a pouch labeled Monsoon Blend in Miss Rao's script. The thermos I placed center stage, its seam of damage glinting beneath fluorescent halos. I told Rena how the crack was no flaw but a vent, the scar tissue through which history breathes. She ran a finger along its edge and nodded the way one nods at a scar that has learned to speak. Word of tea stories, traveled by mouth faster than any flyer. Children arrived after final bell, cheeks ruddy from wind, palms carrying secrets, a poem scrawled on notebook margins, a toy car without wheels, a Polaroid of a father last seen 5 Christmases ago. We brewed a pot, poured it into chipped mugs, and wrote a single line together. One sentence meant not for themselves but for the child who might sit in that chair tomorrow, trembling with uncertainty. If they couldn't summon words, they drew constellations, intersections of stars that might guide strangers home. We tucked each line, each sketch, into origami envelopes and sealed them with library stamps. Then at night, Rena and I ventured into the town's small darkness, leaving envelopes in predictable and unpredictable places. Bus stops, playground swings suspended over snowdrifts, the warped seat outside the shuttered feed store. We kept no ledger of recipients. The game depended on not knowing. Soon, evidence of reception drifted back. A thank you note appeared beneath the library door, written in a grandfather's trembling cursive. The tea you left tasted like mornings on the Mekong. I believed I'd forgotten the smell of my childhood rice field. Thank you for loaning it back. A shy seventh grader began shelving biographies without being asked. Each afternoon he folded a new envelope and placed it in my breast pocket. His sentences were questions. If trees can be patient for 100 years, how patient can a human heart be? I answered none directly. Answers fossilize wonder. Instead, I brewed hibiscus and rosemary, a friction of brightness and ache, and let silence carry the response. Weeks hardened into a season. Snow receded. Mud season heaved its slow exhalations. The town's benches re-emerged, waterlogged but sturdy. On the last day of March, I found the thermos missing from its shelf. A ripple of worry flared. Had a child mistaken it for communal property? But beside the vacancy, an envelope waited, sealed with a library stamp. The lid may leak, but the stories never have. I need its heat tonight. I hope that's all right. No signature, only a sketch of mountains stitched to clouds. I felt an instinctive tug to retrieve the relic lineage, demands preservation, yet a hush deeper than fear steadied my pulse. The chain had chosen a new link. Custody, like breath, must be relinquished to remain alive. I looked out the arched window and pictured the thermos steaming on some nameless horizon. Perhaps beside a farm fence where a teenager contemplated vanishing. Perhaps on a hospital windowsill where a night shift nurse counted heartbeats. The crack would glint under another latitude, and that glint would spell possibility. Days later, I learned a 16-year-old named Luis had taken it. His mother described how he sat vigil outside his grandfather's hospice room, pouring tea for visitors, repeating a sentence he claimed fell out of the sky: "Let warmth be the language we speak while we still can." The hospice director called it the calmest passing he'd witnessed, steam looping through grief like ribbons of incense. Luis returned the thermos after the funeral, eyes bright with the humility of someone entrusted with fire. I asked if he'd keep it. He shook his head. Others are waiting. Spring rehearsed itself in tentative greens. Rena proposed we formalize the project, apply for grants, print brochures, build an app to pair thermos guardians with benches worldwide. My chest tightened. Professionalization threatened a sepsis, the way museums drain color from folk quilts. Yet I heard Ms. Rao's final note rustling. Hope is a living language. Living things grow, mutate, shed skin. I signed the paperwork under one condition: no brand logo on the thermoses. Let the crack be the signature. By summer, parcels crossed borders. A retired dentist in Manila requested instructions. A prison librarian in Saskatchewan described inmates trading paragraphs through cell bars, each scrap steeped in chamomile smuggled from the infirmary. At the program's heart pulsed improvisation. No two blends identical, no two messages fluent in the same dialect. Across this fractal web, mispronunciations blossomed into new idioms of mercy. One humid August dawn, I returned to Alder Park after years away. The bench, the very bench, stood under arching elms, varnish dulled by seasons of sun. A thermos waited, squat and unfamiliar, teal enamel chipped to reveal tin. A note fluttered, anchored by a pebble smoothed beyond recognition. I expected directions, an invitation, some descendant of Ms. Rao's forward-leaning hand. Instead, 8 words only. Thank you for leaving the lights on. No signature, yet the period at the end felt less like finality and more like a clasp, the subtle click when a chain completes its loop. I sat, poured a cup. The tea tasted of lemon balm and something smoky, like documents burned to protect their secrets. Above the tree line, dawn cracked open, spilling light onto frost-silvered grass, exactly as it had the morning I first believed in unseen guardians. Across the path, a man in a charcoal suit paused, brow furrowed at the sight of steam. I lifted the thermos in offering. He hesitated, then crossed the divide, accepting the cup with the tentative grip of someone unpracticed in receiving. "It's free?" he asked. "No," I said, meeting his puzzled blink with a smile I recognized from Ms. Rao's quiet ledger. "It's already paid for." We drank without exchanging names. Birds rehearsed autumn chorales overhead, and the city's machinery hummed awake. Somewhere, Luis was filling the cracked thermos with jasmine for a new vigil. Somewhere, envelopes unfolded themselves in strangers' pockets like origami wings. Somewhere further still, a geography of benches waiting. And here, on a frost-dusted slat, steam wove 2 solitudes into temporary fellowship. I felt the ellipsis of Miss Rao's obituary elongate across generations until it curved, gentle as a cup's rim, and in that curve the silence of rescue spoke fluently at last. Somming Kopel Holben light years undating. If one act of uncredited kindness can reroute a lifetime, how many hidden constellations of mercy might already be glittering above us, waiting for the moment we finally tilt our heads and notice they spell our own unfinished name? Some stories refuse to click shut. They insist on breathing a little longer, like coals that stay incandescent beneath snow, daring anyone with numb hands to dig. Years after Ms. Rao's obituary dissolved into pulp and greyhound tickets and bench-led orbits, her chain of thermoses has grown into something no ledger could have prophesied, a half-visible constellation of strangers who trade heat the way old sailors once traded star maps, by rumor, by instinct, by the lilt in another traveler's voice that says, "I know that loneliness too." The network has no headquarters, no bylaws, only a pulse. Yet a perpetual custodian, reluctant cartographer, keep being summoned whenever one link rusts or another flares. It was such a summons, delivered on the back of a faded postcard, that carried me northward on the last weekend of October toward a lakeside village whose name sounded like wind trying to clear its throat, Kawitik. The postcard showed a moonlit pier etched into black water. Beneath it, in the rounded handwriting of a child, 4 words, "Your thermos cracked here." I traveled by night train, the carriage filled with the hush of commuters pretending sleep. Through streaked windows, forests unfurled as negative space, trees flashing like old film reels. Every bend echoed with the same unspoken concern. If one link breaks, does the whole chain unravel? I clutched Ms. Rao's original notebooks already foxed at the edges, feeling the fragile hinge of history. Kawetik Station was scarcely more than a heated shelter. Frost feathered the platform. Lake air tasted of iron and pine. I followed a gravel path to the water's edge where a wooden pier extended into silver opacity. Perched at its furthest plank sat a battered thermos, lid off, steam shredding in the dawn wind. Beside it, a girl of maybe 12 stared at her reflection, as though deciding which version of herself might keep breathing. She didn't turn when I sat a careful distance away. The thermos between us hissed quietly. Its seam split wide, no hairline fracture, but a chasm. Amber tea dripped through the gap, purling on the boards before skittering into the lake. Loss made liquid. "I'm sorry it's broken," I said softly. "I thought if I poured enough," she answered without looking, "it would stay full." Her voice was raw silk, strong yet fraying. "Everything leaks though, even promises." Wind rattled the planks. I saw now that the thermos was ours. The thermos, the same dented cylinder traced through decades. Somehow it had traveled further than any of us. Arriving in her custody exhausted, the chain's oldest link had finally given way. "What happened?" I asked. She shrugged. "Granddad's heart stopped last month. He was teaching me how to brew stories you can taste. When he died, I tried to keep serving tea at the bus stop like he did, but the lid snapped in the cold. Now the town says the ritual should end. They call it unhygienic." She spit the last word like a pebble. I smoothed a palm over the weather-pocked metal, feeling history radiate like trapped sunlight. Every previous guardian had added a scratch, a stain, a faint scent of their homeland. I imagined Ms. Rao's hand guiding the stream of memory into this girl's future, and I felt the weight of inheritance shift again. "The ritual doesn't live in steel," I said. "It lives in the hand that offers, in the throat that swallows warmth it didn't earn." She finally faced me, eyes lake grey, rimmed red. "But a chain is only strong as its willingness to change shape," I finished. I reached into my satchel, produced a slender vacuum flask, brand new but unbranded. No cracks yet, plenty of room for stories. She cupped it like a candle inside chilled fingers. Steam fogged the space between us, and I realized my arrival had always been less about repair than permission. Permission to let the oldest link retire, to trust that lineage isn't a single relic but a renewable act of faith. We poured the last of the leaking Assam into a pair of enamel mugs, careful to catch drips before the lake could drink them. The tea tasted faintly of rust and bergamot, and possibility, imperfection steeped into comfort. Birds skimmed the water, stitching pale wake lines that shimmered then vanished. I asked her what she planned next. "I think," she said, voice steadier, "I'll host Saturdays at the pier. Free cups for anyone waiting for the ferry. No notes yet. I'm not good with words." "Neither was I admitted. "The first line will find you." We sipped in companionable hush until sun shards cracked the horizon. She wrapped the cracked thermos in an old quilt and handed it to me. "Could you keep it safe?" She hesitated. "Or bury it if that's kinder." I felt the object's tired hum, the fatigue of decades spent warming palms that never learned its full journey. "I'll decide nothing until it speaks," I promised. That evening, in a lakeside guesthouse where floorboards sang with age, I cleaned the thermos, dried it, and set it on the desk. Moonlight slanted through lace curtains, turning the metal into a dull altar. I opened Ms. Rao's first notebook. On the inside cover, beneath her columns, hid a faint penciled sketch I'd never noticed, a circle of hands passing a single cup clockwise, steam rising like a spiral galaxy. At the circle's center, she'd written one sentence: Nothing is lost if its warmth is remembered. I closed the book, looked at the fissured lid, and understood the thermos did not want burial, it wanted dispersal, to be remade not as vessel, but as constellation. I fetched a screwdriver from my travel kit, pried the seam until the cylinder separated into gleaming halves. I polished the fragments, etched a word inside each with a jeweler's pick: sip, revise, continue, begin, return. 5 shards, 5 seeds of story heat. At dawn, I mailed them to 5 addresses chosen by instinct: Luis in the city hospice, Rena at the grain depot library, the storm green-eyed boy now studying urban planning, the man in the charcoal suit whose name I still never knew, and the girl at Cowatic Pier, though hers I kept unsent for the moment, knowing she already carried the furnace of beginnings. In each package I included no explanation, only a line from Ms. Rao: hope effloresces where metal fails. Then I brewed a fresh pot, lavender, lapsang, a pinch of orchard wind, and stood on the pier's edge, pouring a thin libation into the lake. Steam rose, mingling with autumn mist, and I felt the chain elongate beyond enumeration. No single link, no master custodian, only a widening choreography of warmth. A text vibrated my phone. Louise had installed his shard in the hospice common room, string-lit like a votive. Visitors now slipped messages inside its hollow, to be read aloud during vigil hour. Another ping, Rena's shard suspended above the biography table, catching sunbeams like a quiet bell. Responses rippled outward faster than I could count. Back in the guest house, I wrote a single universal note, small enough to fit any bench. If this cup finds you, its story begins with you. Let it leak if it must. Every drip remembers home. I folded 20 copies, slid them into my satchel beside the unsent shard. Tomorrow, new benches, new hands, the chain forever reforging itself in unnamed kilns. As night deepened, the lakeshore sighed in long, sleep-heavy breaths. I closed my eyes and felt the thermos's absence not as void but as orchestra, each shard chiming in a different longitude, transmitting minor key harmonies of rescue. In that chorus I finally heard the rumble of Miss Rao's ellipsis resolving into full cadence, not period, a measure completed, yet echoing into the next bar. And somewhere, on a pier lit by early stars, a 12-year-old girl practiced pouring tea from a new flask, rehearsing the tremor of her first sentence to an invisible stranger whose life, unknown to them both, already cinched one link tighter to the quietly infinite chain. Son Cosmet, when the instrument of mercy breaks and you scatter its pieces to far-flung hands, does the story fracture, or does it finally discover how many hearts can thrum the same unfinished chord?